Hello again, everybody. It is Saturday, May 29th. Wanted to weigh in on this uh, kerfluffle making its way around the internet right now about the origin of COVID-19, the SARS-2 virus. Uh, just to summarize quickly, there's now more talk, not that it ever really went away, there's been more talk that maybe the virus that we're combating globally originated in the lab in China, in Wuhan. And that's a big deal. We'll talk about why it's a big deal, I guess, because if it's true, it might be a big deal. First of all, where I'm coming in from. So when this thing first came out, and the simplest parsimonious explanation for the origin of SARS-2 was that it was the same as SARS-1 and MERS, which is a Middle Eastern version of the same thing. SARS is an acronym, just so you know. SARS means severe acute respiratory syndrome, and MERS was Middle East respiratory syndrome. SARS-1 originated somewhere in Asia. I'm not sure I even know where it originated. MERS originated in the Middle East. People got it from cattle, not cattle. Said the wrong word. Camels. Okay. And SARS-2 was thought to have originated in the same way via bats or something like that, similar to SARS-1. So the most parsimonious answer is that people are still messing around with the zoonotic viruses in an unhealthy way, and how that happens is another matter. Maybe there's more people, maybe there's more animals, maybe there's more viruses, maybe there's more contact with animals. Who really knows? But we're messing around with things that are not cool, and we shouldn't be doing that, and we're getting sick as a consequence. We're right now discussing where SARS-2 came from, but I don't think there's any real debate about where SARS-1 or MERS came from. Just like there's no debate about where the Spanish flu came from in 1918. There was some point at which we were starting to be able to mess around with genetics enough that people could start thinking, maybe they're going to originate a pathogen or something. There have been lots of science fiction movies about that. I mean, that could be a real thing now. It's true. Technology has really moved along. So that's that's out there now. We could screw up and release some pathogen on the human species and suffer some consequences from that. But the ability to kind of do that in a serious way is fairly recent. But just as an example of how things can get lost in translation, I just mentioned the 1918 Spanish flu. That was actually influenza, hence the name flu. It was not a coronavirus, so different pathogen. But the Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. It was in Spain, but it was a global pandemic. It was in most of the nations, including South Pacific islands. Okay, but it got the moniker Spanish flu, and a lot of people thought that the Spanish flu must have originated in Spain. What are those Spaniards doing that they got everybody so sick? Well, more recent evidence from actual studies of the epidemiology of the spread of the virus, the influenza, in 1918, suggests it didn't originate in Spain at all. It originated in the United States, and in fact, they think it originated on a Georgian pig farm in Georgia, something like that. It's an interesting story. There's lots of YouTube videos on this now because this is sort of recent work, and so you can pick up a YouTube video. Don't look for Spanish flu. Actually, look for 1918 pandemic, because that's what you really should call it. The reason why, I'll explain why this is important in a minute. The reason why it was called the Spanish flu was because in 1918 the world was at war. Today we call it the First World War. Back then they called it the Great War, and everybody was at war, and they were moving troops around, and the newspapers were reporting on the war and trying to get people to buy war bonds and trying to get people to, do all the things that you do patriotically during war. And when this virus started to spread, initially it was among troops, because troops were really the only ones who could move very much back then. Transportation was nothing like it is now, but trains did move across the country, and the trains were being used to move troops and ammunition to the East Coast to go to Europe. So as troops were moving around, as they became sick, the military put an embargo on any news about troops being sick. Why? Because you don't want to telegraph to your enemy that maybe you're not sending as many troops as they think you are, or they see you are, when they spy, see trains going back and forth full of soldiers, and they're making calculations in their mind of what they're going to do when these soldiers show up in the European theater, and to let the enemy know that actually, no, we're not sending a lot of troops, because they're all coming down sick. So they embargoed that news, and everyone else embargoed that news. No one wanted to talk about our troop numbers not what they appeared to be, because actually everybody is sick with the flu. So there was no talking about this. When the influenza in 1918 finally arrived in Spain, Spain was neutral. Spain didn't have a dog in that fight. And so when they started getting sick and dropping in the streets and hospitals filling up, morgues filling up, and cemeteries filling up, because influenza was quite lethal. The Spanish media was all over that. Look at this. We've got an influenza. It's terrible. It's killing people. And people piling up on the sidewalks, and people piling up in the morgues. And so since that news was not embargoed and that news got out, it was called the Spanish flu, because that's the first anybody ever heard of it. There was a flu in Spain. Good Lord, what's going on in Spain? What have those Spaniards been up to? Well, it was really the U.S. flu as a practical matter. And we got it, we humans, got it from pigs. Pigs are a common vector for zoonotic transmission of disease to humans. You could look up why that is, but it's true. We have a close relationship with pigs. There are lots of pigs when there are pigs. There's lots of humans around pigs when there are pigs. Pigs are commercial. We transport them around live and dead. So it's not too surprising that we will get a pig flu. We had one just recently, actually, that was people were really worried about. They call them swine flus. They're afraid it was going to get out of hand and come to North America and all that kind of stuff. So this happens a lot, but it can be confusing. It can be confusing because of the way information moves around, the way propaganda works, and people having an agenda actually with regards to information. Do you get it or do you not? And if you do get it, did it leak out of some place, and how information could be tainted as a consequence? So when we got SARS-1, it was a big deal in Asia. It never really came to North America, and it was quite fatal. SARS-1 was really bad. It was really a nightmare for those people. And then MERS hit the Middle East and Africa, I believe, and it was a big deal for them. But again, that's not as big an information market as even Asia is, so we didn't hear too much about that. But SARS-1 was a big deal. So naturally, the Asian nations devoted a lot of resources to studying how that happened to them. Okay, we didn't study it, we didn't care, it didn't happen to us, but they were concerned about that. Not too surprisingly, since it could impact nations in the West, peoples living in the West, there was a broader global concern about it, and some money was at the global level was allocated to China, and they started working on this problem, trying to understand zoonotic transmission of, in this case, coronavirus. So when SARS-2 came out, and it was first discovered in China, it was first discovered by a doctor who was just working on a patient and said, hey, this guy's sick. The symptoms look familiar. I think we've got another SARS. And ironically, that doctor got sick and died later. The Chinese were just all over that, like, no, we can't be having this. This is not true. This is, you're making things up. In fact, that guy got arrested. That doctor in China got arrested for spreading misinformation or something. I don't know what the actual charge was, but he was arrested, and then he died from it. So it's like, well, maybe he was onto something. So there was a big kerfluffle about, the Chinese response to SARS-2, which we now call COVID-19. COVID is an acronym, coronavirus ID-19, and no, it's not the 19th one. It was discovered in 2019. I don't know why we're not up to COVID-21. I guess the variants are different enough to get their own ID, regardless. So we're calling it COVID-19. It's SARS-2. And whether it was smart or not, people immediately started saying, hey, we got it from bats or pangolins or civet cats, or what happened this time, right? Because that's been the pattern. The 1918 pandemic was pigs, and there's been duck flus, bird flus of various kinds, and various swine flus, and now we've got these the coronavirus, which is a different type of bug, but it's comes to us from animals. And so that was what we call the best fit or most parsimonious answer. Is that once again we had a zoonotic transmission. We're still doing things with animals we probably shouldn't be doing, and that's what people thought. Now there was some rumor mongering or discussion that it came from a lab in Wuhan, and they released it, and it's a virus that's been weaponized, and they released it on the world, and it's a die-off, and it's a culling, and they're going to kill all the white people, or whatever that was about. I didn't give much credibility to it, because the simplest answer is it happened again. It's happened before, it happened recently, and this is the second time, in fact, that severe acute respiratory syndrome has come at us from Asia. That probably has to do with their animal husbandry practices, maybe something else, who knows. But in any case, the most parsimonious, simplest answer was that, yes, once again, it jumped from bats or civet cats or something into humans. This was reinforced by later observations that it could jump from humans back into animals. Denmark, who knew? Denmark has a large ermine industry. Ermine is a white mink, I think. Anyway, ermine is a white fur, and they have a huge ermine industry. And of course, they do it on this industrial scale where they have ermines living in little tiny little boxes like this, and they're all crammed together. And the ermine got SARS-2 from us. They got it from us. So it jumped into the ermine. And the Danes were so terrified that it would jump back out of the ermine into humans that they culled their entire ermine industry. As far as I know, most of it. 5 million ermine were euthanized and buried, something like that. That was a huge cost for them, clearly. I'm sure their industry was not, prepared to do that. And yet they did it, because it would have been disastrous if something that had jumped from an unknown animal into humans jumped into ermine and then jumped back into humans. If that had been allowed to continue, who knows what we'd end up with. I mean, this thing could be extremely virulent, extremely dangerous, maybe even extremely lethal. Every time a virus like this makes a zoonotic jump, either from humans to an animal or from an animal back to humans, it picks up tricks. It picks up a little bit of some spare DNA, a little bits and pieces of this, and then when it comes back to humans and it's been roaming around inside the animal population, it jumps back into humans from them back into us. They got it from us, and we get it back from them. You could have a real monster on your hands. So that was why, the Danish government decided to go ahead and cull the herd of ermine. So it obviously can do this. And when we're seeing zoo animals getting sick with coronavirus, not dying from it, but they're getting sick from it, right? We see zoo animals getting it. We house pets, people's cats, getting sick with it. Then it reinforces this idea that this virus is just really good at that. It's really good at that. It's jumping from humans to animals, animals to humans, jumping, trampoline time, right? That's how it's been. That's actually observation on the ground. So there wasn't a whole lot of chatter about, well, it came from a lab and it got released and all this kind of stuff. But just recently, this guy, Nicholas Wade, I think, kind of blew the lid off of this. He did an analysis of COVID-19 and how it's structured. And it's circumstantial evidence, meaning it's not like we have a test tube from Wuhan and it has coronavirus in it, and this is the same one. If we had direct evidence, we'd say, oh yeah, look at this. They have a whole lab full of this stuff, and now it's loose in the environment. It must have come from there. We don't have that kind of direct evidence, but we do have this circumstantial evidence that if you look at the virus and you look at how viruses appear in nature, meaning their actual genetics and the proteins that they're made out of, and the genetics, the underlying genetics, a code for those proteins. If you look at viruses in the wild and how they're built, and you look at this virus, its DNA and how it's built, they don't line up. Interesting. But the wild viruses don't line up with the viruses that's making the rounds through humans and, of course, animals. They don't quite line up. So if the virus that's in us came from nature, they should, right? It came from nature. Now it's in us. It should line up, but they don't. They don't quite line up. Interesting. And he gave a technical discussion of the parts that don't line up and how interesting those parts are, that they actually look like lab signature, that the way in which the virus that's making its way through us right now is configured would match lab practices. I don't know how else to say it. Stick with that for now, shall we? There's an actual technical discussion. It was interesting. I understood it. I'm a biologist. So I was listening very carefully and said, interesting. So I'm not a virologist. I don't work in a lab. I've never worked in a lab. Some of the discussion about the level of lab safety was interesting, that coronavirus is considered so unlikely to spread in humans, and it's not really considered particularly lethal anyway. It's not influenza, for example, and certainly not smallpox. That they were using, mid-level lab defenses as opposed to high-tier lab defenses. You can have a biohaz level, I think it's 4 or 5. That's bubble suits and negative air pressure and all this kind of stuff, and washing your bubble suit down before you go in or out of the lab and all this kind of stuff. So you can have some pretty high level biohaz laboratories, and this one in Wuhan wasn't one of those because they weren't working with anything especially deadly or that was expected to be particularly contagious. And why were they working with coronavirus at all? Well, because of SARS-1. That was a thing. SARS-1 was a thing. And SARS-1 could have been a big deal. It had the makings of a pandemic. And it was SARS-1 that, well, I think it was only called SARS-1 after SARS-2 came around. But anyway, SARS-1 was what kind of got everybody nervous about where all this may be heading. So labs were set up. People started studying zoonotic transmission. They were looking at coronavirus in particular. We've had swine flus, that's influenza, but we know that we're vulnerable to this. And as we become a more global species and we have more trade and people are just flying around more, traveling more, the opportunity for these things to opportunistically jump from animals to humans and then to travel in the human population laterally is really, really high. High probability that's going to happen, and it's really bad when it does. And we kind of saw that play out with SARS-2. It really did. It really did happen. We really did get a global pandemic. Now, COVID-19 is not especially lethal. No one wants to die from it, of course. And we really don't know the entire story of what the, I guess they call it long COVID, right? What the trajectory is for recovery for people. There are people who have some severe problems from it. But in any case, it was worth studying. And now we're looking at the virus, and they've done a little more work, and it's looking like it may have escaped from the lab. So fine. Now, thinking about the Spanish flu, okay, the Spanish got blamed for that. It wasn't their fault. It didn't originate in Spain. They were just the first ones to talk about it. So where did COVID-19 come from? Okay, maybe it came from animals. We've had lots and lots of that. We'll have lots of that in the future. Could it have come from a lab? Well, maybe it did. After SARS-1, they were absolutely working on this kind of question. What is this thing? How does it transmit? What part of the virus changes to make it compatible with humans, and a bunch of other things. So were they looking at it? Sure, they were looking at it. They got hammered pretty hard by the first SARS panic. So yeah, they were looking at that. All of us were looking at that, really. All the labs in the world were looking at that, because SARS-1 was a near miss, and MERS was a near miss. MERS, by the way, was very lethal. It was really bad, and people have been very concerned about what's going to happen with all this. So were the Chinese looking at coronavirus? Yeah, they were. Okay, no question. Now, to this question of could it escape from a lab? Sure. They were not doing biohazard level 5. You know, they weren't wearing bubble suits and negative air pressure and all that kind of stuff. Could it? Yeah, it could have escaped. Again, it's not considered particularly lethal, so they probably weren't that worried about it. But to this notion that they would have deliberately released it, okay, so that's not a thing, folks. That's just not a thing. If a state actor was going to do something like that, they were going to release it and call humanity or something, they wouldn't release it literally from their front door. Okay, it might accidentally do that. Someone comes in contact with the virus, goes out the front door, goes to a noodle shop across the street, gets some noodles, cough, and now it's out. But they're not going to release it out the front door by walking out the front door with a vial, throwing it out in the street and laughing and going back inside. That's not what's going to happen. If you want to start talking about biowarfare and weaponization of viruses and releasing viruses and all this kind of stuff, it's not even going to be coronavirus. The thing you're going to talk about is smallpox, anthrax, Ebola, right? Weaponized Ebola. Who really knows what they might be thinking about or doing or something else, but it's not going to be coronavirus. It's just not lethal enough, really. And you're not going to release it out your front door into the noodle shop across the street or the wet market across the street or anything else. No, you're going to be a little more careful than that. So if we are going to get any kind of weaponized virus that's going to be released into the world, and it's going to do all this damage and cause a general die-off of humans or something like that, it's not going to be like we just saw with SARS-2, COVID-19. Okay, that is not the signature. Maybe there was something going on in a lab and something got out accidentally because they weren't really observing especially rigorous biohazard formula, but so maybe it did, but it's not going to look like this. We are going to have more zoonotic releases. Even if this COVID-19 turns out to have been a mistake in a lab that somehow got out because they weren't really exercising all that many cautions anyway, there will be others that won't come from a lab. They'll come from exactly what happened with SARS-1, MERS, the 1918 pandemic, Ebola, everything else is going to come from contact with animals. That's how it's done. It jumps from animals to humans. Ebola comes from eating bushmeat that's not properly cooked. And then we get the Ebola prion. I think that's what it is, prion. And then we transmit it human to human because it's really easy to transmit. We get it from animals. There's no lab working with Ebola. Could they work with Ebola? They don't even need to do anything with Ebola to weaponize it. It's already weaponized. It's already like 90% lethal. What are you going to do? Aerosolize it or something? I suppose you could. But we are already doing this to ourselves. We don't need anybody in some shadowy lab somewhere, the Illuminati or whatever, to do this to us. We can do this to ourselves. We're perfectly capable of coming in contact with animals that are carrying pathogens that once they jump into us by some random event or mutation or exposure or something can be harmful to humans. We've been doing that. We've been doing that for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. We've been doing that recently. So you don't need a big conspiracy theory to explain what happened. Yes, it might have been a lab. Okay, that's interesting. It's a cautionary tale. It's definitely a reason to be very careful when you're dealing with these pathogens that can and have been known to jump from animals to humans. They can do that. They can do that. And were the Chinese being a little bit sloppy? Maybe. Did they cover it up after it got out, or after it was? Who knows if the Chinese even knew at the time where it came from? The Chinese authorities didn't have any more information about it than any of us did. I'm seriously, it wasn't like the premier of China went into the lab, got a vial, threw it out in the street, broke it, and went inside laughing. Okay, that isn't what would have happened regardless. So they didn't even necessarily know where it came from, but they did, squash any investigations. They wouldn't let doctors in, and they wouldn't let investigators in, and then when the WHO, the WHO, the World Health Organization, did show up, they had all these Chinese minders making sure they didn't ask too many questions and controlling the documents they looked at, and then they left, and then they came back saying, we didn't learn anything. We're back. Show us more. And they just kept trying to get information, and it would have been better if the Chinese authorities had been more open about the whole thing. But would American authorities have been any more open if it had happened to us? We certainly weren't. With the 1918 pandemic, we totally sat on that. We just totally didn't tell anybody. It was wartime, troop movements, blah, 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 but we sat on it. We didn't tell anybody we had that. We also didn't tell anybody we were sending it to Europe. You want our troops? We'll send our troops. Oh, by the way, half of them are sick with influenza, but hey, you're going to get troops. We didn't tell anybody what was happening. So, yeah, everybody does that, okay? Everybody wants to put things in the best possible light. We did that in 1918 when it was our turn, and the Chinese did it in 2019 when it was their turn, 100 years later. So yes, that happens. But did they release it on purpose, and was it deliberate, and did they? Well, I guess we'll know more over time. Maybe it was deliberate. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, if it was going to be deliberate, it would not have been done that like that, where you get your own people sick first. Really? And what's the point? China is a global leader in manufacturing and and shipping. And why would they want a global pandemic? Man, they got whacked hard, and the global economy still hasn't come back. And now Chinese bonds, in real estate and things are on shaky ground because their income stream has been interrupted, and all these market turbulence, and their economy could still implode. Why would they do that to themselves? Okay, maybe it was an accident. All right, fine. They did it on accident. Anybody can do things on accident. And we still don't know if it came out of a lab. But, Nicholas Wade made an interesting argument. I listened to it. It was compelling. Doesn't mean it's true, but it is more data than we had a year ago this time, when all this was, still pretty new. So, yeah, there's a virus making the rounds. Did it originate in a lab? Maybe. I guess we'll know more later. Did it need to originate in a lab? No, absolutely not. And the next one might not. In fact, in all probability, won't. In all probability, it'll be just like these things always are. We're mistreating animals. We're raising them in conditions where they're unhealthy, they're sick, they're spreading viruses among themselves, and then a 1 in a million chance one of those things jumps into a human handler, the human gets sick, the virus happens to have the right characteristics to spread between humans, and now we have lateral transfer of the virus across the human population. And now you've got SARS-1, MERS, influenza, 1918 influenza, all these kinds of things. So that's the more likely thing to have happen. That's the more likely thing, because that has happened a lot. That has happened a lot. And there's no reason to expect it won't happen again. And you need to know that. It doesn't matter. You should still wear a mask, social distance, get your vaccine. When there's a pandemic, you should accept that it's healthy and constructive and sensible to limit your travel and suffer through some kind of a lockdown to keep this thing localized. And we didn't do those things, so we suffered from it pretty horrendously. Other nations did do those things correctly. New Zealand didn't suffer nearly as much. So there are ways to deal with these things. It doesn't matter where they start, whether it dropped out of a lab or came out of a civet cat in some market someplace where animals are being abused, essentially. Doesn't matter. The reaction is still the same. Will there be more of these things in the future? I think there's a real concern that a virus could be weaponized. It's not going to be coronavirus. I guarantee you that. It's going to be Ebola or smallpox returned or anthrax or something like that. Botulism, who knows? Something that's really, really lethal, right? Something that'll actually kill you. Weaponizing something like that would make a lot more sense if that's what anyone wants to do. I think what we've learned from coronavirus is that this is not a game you should be playing. So if the lab origin of the COVID-19 turns out to be true, then that's a lesson to everybody that these are not games you should be playing. This does not necessarily go the way you think. I don't think that's what the Chinese were doing at all. I think what they were doing was probably pretty sensible. They were studying something that burned them badly in previous decades. Okay, so SARS-1. They were applying their technology and they were trying to figure it out. But could we screw it up? Absolutely. There was a Chinese researcher who returned to China after doing a postdoc at one of our universities studying Cas9 CRISPR gene editing. He went back to China and immediately, with or without permission, with or without funding, who knows, we'll never get the story, not out of China, started editing human DNA. He learned the techniques and he returned to China and started editing human DNA. And now there are two little girls walking around in China, born of this couple, who have genetically modified genomes. And that's a fact. And if there's one family that submitted to that procedure, I can guarantee you there's thousands. Why would they do that? Who knows? Who knows how it's being sold to them? Your children will be superior. Or the fact that your family participated in these experiments to better the knowledge attained by the state, then the state will give you perks and binkies and elevate you a little higher than your middle class income would normally allow. You'll just have this mysterious wealth and you'll have this mysterious privilege and thank you for your cooperation. And okay, that's really easy to sell. There could be thousands of people walking around in China right now containing modified DNA. Why would they do that? Well, they did that. Why would they continue doing that? I don't know. What are they hoping to attain? I don't know. But the fact that they did it once means they could do it 1,000 times, and there's nothing to stop them. So, yes, if we get any cautionary tale from COVID-19 and its potential lab origin, it should be that we kind of don't know what we're doing here, and we should stop doing it quickly. And that's probably going to be the common theme running through the next 20 years, is that we haven't known what we're doing. We're messing with systems that we do not comprehend at all, and we're going to get burned. And coronavirus, if it has done anything for us, it's just reminded us that we don't know what we're doing. And editing, the DNA of unborn children, having them be conceived and born with modified DNA, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And the same methodology that's being used to, alter the human genome in real time in situ could be used to, weaponize viruses. But if anyone decides to do that, to gene edit viruses to make them, to weaponize them, it's not going to be a coronavirus. Maybe as a proof of concept, so I guess you got that to worry about. But that's not going to be the sign of end times. Okay, end times is not going to be coronavirus. It just can't do it. Yeah, maybe it will. We'll see, right? So it's good to keep your your ear to the ground and keep your options open. Trying to understand what's happening. Hopefully, we'll learn from COVID-19 one way or the other, either that we have to treat our animals better or not do those kinds of things at all with animals, or somebody in the lab screwed up. Maybe we'll never know. But regardless, yes, we could do this. We might do this. It could get out of the lab. It could be a problem, and people need to know that. That's the lesson from all this. Yes, it could happen. Did it happen this time? Well, I guess we'll know more over time. But absolutely, this could happen, in the right circumstances. Something to keep in mind, right? If you need something to worry about, yeah, we could mess this up.